I'm 32 now, and I've been waiting for this moment for 7 years. 7 years since that Easter brunch when my entire family decided to turn me into their personal punching bag in front of everyone. And now they're outside my property, practically hyperventilating, begging me to help them. But let me back up because this story needs context. I was always the disappointment in my family. My dad Maxwell ran a successful regional trucking business. My sister Bryn married some finance guy who drove a Lexus. And I was the one who got divorced at 25 and moved back home temporarily. That temporary stay turned into the worst 8 months of my life. Every single day was a new opportunity for them to remind me I was worthless. Dad would make comments about how I couldn't even keep a wife. Mom would sigh dramatically whenever I walked into a room. And Bryn would bring her husband Andrew over just so they could have whispered conversations that stopped the second I entered. My uncle Everett joined in whenever he visited, and even Grandpa Wren got in on it. The divorce wasn't even my fault. My ex-wife Lennon had an affair with her CrossFit instructor, but my family acted like I'd somehow failed at being a man. That Easter was supposed to be my goodbye. I'd saved up enough to move out, found a decent apartment 3 hours away, and I was just trying to be civil for one last family gathering. I even brought flowers for Mom, cheap ones from the gas station, because that's all I could afford. But they were fresh, and I thought it was a nice gesture. I walked into that brunch with genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, we could part on decent terms. Dad stood up the second he saw me. He announced to the entire extended family that the pathetic waste of space actually showed his face. Everyone stopped eating. Mom started laughing before he even finished talking, saying those gas station flowers wouldn't make her forget I was a complete failure at 30. Bryn smirked and pointed out I was still wearing the same cheap suit from my divorce hearing 3 years prior. Uncle Everett bellowed across the table that I should stay away from the children because failure might be contagious. Grandpa Wren actually shouted that I should have stayed gone like the coward I was. The whole room erupted in laughter. Cousins, aunts, uncles, everyone thought it was hilarious. I just set the flowers down on the table. I smiled. I told them all to have a wonderful rest of their lives. Then I walked out and never looked back. Here's what they didn't know. I wasn't broken. I was furious. That humiliation burned into my brain, and I spent every single day since then building myself into someone who could make them regret it. I moved to a city where I knew people in construction management, worked my way up fast, and discovered I was actually good at project coordination and logistics. Within 3 years, I was running multi-million-dollar commercial projects. I bought a house. I invested smart. I made connections with developers, contractors, suppliers. Every success felt like another weapon I was storing up for the day they'd need something from me. And I knew that day would come because Dad's business was already struggling back then. He was too proud to admit it, but I'd seen the paperwork he left lying around when I lived there. Equipment maintenance costs were killing him. He was losing contracts to bigger companies, and he refused to modernize. I knew it was only a matter of time. 2 days ago, I got a message on Facebook from Mom. She found me through a mutual friend's tagged photo from a work event. The message was long and desperate. She said Dad's business was in serious trouble and they needed help. They'd lost their 3 biggest contracts in the past year. 2 trucks had broken down beyond reasonable repair, and they were facing some kind of property issue with their warehouse lease that I didn't fully understand from her panicked explanation. She said the bank was threatening foreclosure on their house because Dad had used it as collateral for business loans. She told me Bryn and Andrew were also struggling because Andrew had lost his job 6 months ago, and they'd burned through their savings. She said Grandpa Wren's retirement investments had tanked, and he was living with them now, adding to their expenses. Uncle Everett apparently co-signed on some of Dad's business loans and was freaking out about his own liability. The message ended with her saying I was the only one doing well, that she'd seen photos of my house and knew I worked in construction, and that maybe I could help them figure something out with my connections. She said family helps family. She used the word please 4 times. I didn't respond for 24 hours because I wanted to make sure I had all the information first. I had a friend who works in commercial credit pull some information for me. Completely legal stuff. Just verifying what I'd been told. Turns out it was worse than Mom admitted. Dad's business was maybe 3 months from total collapse. The property situation was that their warehouse landlord was selling the building and Dad's lease was up for renewal at a much higher rate he couldn't afford. Their house was absolutely at risk. Bryn and Andrew had credit card debt in the mid-5 figures. This wasn't just a rough patch. This was complete financial ruin for my entire family. And here's the thing. I actually could help them. I know people who need trucking contracts. I know commercial property owners who might work out a reasonable lease. I have enough saved that I could probably float them some money to buy time. I have the connections and resources to pull them back from the edge. Yesterday, I responded to Mom's message. I told her I'd received it and I needed time to think. She wrote back within 5 minutes begging me to come see them, to just talk it through. She said Dad wanted to apologize. She said they all realized they'd treated me horribly and they were sorry. She kept saying how much they needed me, how I was their only hope, how much they loved me and always had even if they didn't show it well. I told her I'd come by their house this morning at 10 to discuss it. I showed up at exactly 10 driving my BMW. I'd bought it last year as a reward for a successful project, and honestly, I'd been waiting to show it to them someday. I parked in their driveway behind Dad's aging pickup truck. The house looked worse than I remembered. Paint peeling, roof shingles missing, lawn half dead. Before I could even get out of the car, they were pouring out the front door. Mom, Dad, Bryn, Andrew, Grandpa Wren, and Uncle Everett, all of them looking like they hadn't slept in days. Dad started talking immediately about how he knew he'd been wrong, how he'd let his anger at his own failures spill onto me, how he should have been supportive instead of cruel. Mom was crying, saying she was so sorry that she'd been following Dad's lead, but she should have stood up for me. Bryn admitted she'd been jealous because I'd had the courage to leave a bad marriage while she felt trapped in her own life. Andrew just stood there looking humiliated. Grandpa Wren said he was old and stupid and took out his regrets about his own life on me. Uncle Everett said he'd always been insecure around Dad and joined in the cruelty to feel included. They all talked over each other, desperate, explaining, justifying, apologizing. They said I was their only option, that they'd tried everything else, that the bank wouldn't extend them more time, that they were about to lose everything including the house Dad's parents had left him. Mom kept saying how much potential I'd always had, how she always knew I'd succeed, how proud she was of what I'd built. Dad said he should have helped me after my divorce instead of kicking me when I was down. I let them finish. I stood there in their driveway in my tailored suit, not the cheap one from 7 years ago, but a real one I'd had custom made, and I listened to every word. When they finally stopped talking and just stared at me waiting for my response, I smiled. The same peaceful smile I'd given them at that Easter brunch. I told them I'd think about it and let them know. Then, I got back in my car and drove away. The messages started within an hour. Texts, Facebook messages, even a call from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Bryn using a friend's phone. They were all saying variations of the same thing. Please don't make them wait, they're desperate. They need to know if I'll help. They're running out of time. Mom sent a message saying the bank had scheduled the foreclosure proceedings and they had less than 60 days. Dad sent one saying his biggest remaining client was leaving next month, and that would be the final blow. I haven't responded to any of them. I'm sitting in my home office right now looking at their messages pile up, and I'm trying to figure out exactly how I want to handle this. Because here's what I know. I spent 7 years preparing for this exact scenario. I knew their cruelty would eventually circle back around. I knew Dad's stubbornness would tank his business. I knew their perfect lives were built on debt and luck that would run out. And I built myself into someone who could either save them or watch them burn. The petty part of me wants to tell them exactly what they told me. That they're failures, that they're pathetic, that they should have thought about this before they decided to humiliate someone who might have actually cared about them. I want to throw every insult back in their faces and make them feel every ounce of shame they dumped on me. But the calculated part of me knows there's a better way to make this hurt. They came to me because they're desperate and out of options. That means I have all the leverage. I can help them just enough to keep them dependent, make them dance on strings, watch them debase themselves over and over trying to earn my assistance. Or I can help them with conditions that benefit me massively. Or I can just let them think I might help while I do absolutely nothing and watch their world collapse. What's eating at me is that part of me actually wants to help. Not because I forgive them. I don't, not even close, but because completely destroying them feels too easy, too quick. They'd lose everything. Maybe file bankruptcy, move into some apartment somewhere, and eventually rebuild smaller lives. But if I keep them hanging, if I help just enough to keep hope alive while making them work for every scrap of assistance, I can make this last for years. I can make them prove their apologies. I can make them understand exactly what they lost when they decided I was acceptable collateral for their own insecurities. The messages keep coming. Mom just sent another one saying she's never asking me for anything ever again if I'll just help them this once. Dad sent one saying he'll sign over part of the business to me if I can save it. Bryn sent one saying she'll do whatever I need. She'll apologize publicly. She'll tell everyone what they did to me. Anything. And that's when I realized they still don't get it. They think this is a negotiation. They think if they just say the right words or make the right offers, I'll fold and help because we're family. They don't understand that I've been waiting for this. That every choice I made for 7 years was building toward having them exactly where they are right now. Powerless, desperate, and completely dependent on whether I decide to be merciful. I'm not their failure son anymore. I'm their only lifeline, and I'm going to take my time deciding what that's worth to me. Update 1. You guys wanted an update, so here it is. And buckle up because things escalated fast in the past week. Shout out to everyone who said to make them sweat. You were absolutely right about how satisfying this would be. So I left off with my family blowing up my phone, begging for help after they completely destroyed me 7 years ago. I hadn't responded to any of their messages, and honestly, I was enjoying watching the desperation climb with each new text. But I knew I couldn't stay silent forever because that would end the game too quickly. I needed them engaged, hopeful, and working for every scrap of possibility I dangled in front of them. 3 days after my visit, I sent a message to the family group chat they'd created specifically to coordinate their begging campaign. I told them I was willing to discuss options, but I needed complete transparency about their financial situation first. I said if they wanted my help, they needed to show me everything. Bank statements, loan documents, contract details, all of it. I framed it as due diligence, told them I couldn't make informed decisions without seeing the full scope of the problem. What I was really doing was making them expose every vulnerability they had. Mom responded within 30 seconds, saying they'd prepare everything. Dad sent a separate message saying he appreciated me being willing to consider it, and he understood I needed to protect myself. Bryn sent some long paragraph about how grateful she was that I was even talking to them. They were falling over themselves to comply. We set up a meeting for that Saturday at a chain restaurant near their house. Not some coffee shop, but one of those family dining places with booths and decent food. I picked it specifically because it was public enough that they'd have to keep their composure, but private enough for the kind of detailed conversation we needed to have. I showed up 20 minutes late on purpose. They were already there in a corner booth looking like they'd aged 10 years in the past week. Dad had a folder thick with papers. Mom kept wringing her hands, and Bryn looked like she'd been crying recently. I slid into the booth across from them and got right to it. I told Dad to walk me through the business situation first. He started explaining how 3 major contracts had ended within 6 months of each other. One company went with a larger national carrier, another was bought out and consolidated their logistics, and the third one Dad admitted he'd lost because of reliability issues when 2 of his trucks broke down during critical deliveries. He said the warehouse lease situation was that the owner was selling the property to a development company, and the new owners wanted to triple his rent because they planned to renovate the whole industrial park. He couldn't afford the increase and couldn't find comparable warehouse space in his operating area for anything reasonable. I asked him how much he needed to stay afloat. He said if he could secure 2 decent-sized contracts and find affordable warehouse space, he could probably survive. But he needed capital to repair his existing trucks, and he was tapped out. The number he threw out was substantial but not impossible. I wrote it down without commenting. Then I turned to Bryn and Andrew. I asked them what their situation looked like. Andrew finally spoke up. First time I'd heard him actually engage directly, and admitted he'd been laid off from his finance job and hadn't found anything comparable since. He'd been applying everywhere, but the market was competitive, and his previous company had downsized their entire department so he couldn't even get good references. They'd burned through their savings, covering their mortgage and living expenses. Bryn added that they had 2 kids now, something I barely knew since we hadn't spoken in years. And childcare costs were killing them, even with Bryn working full-time as a dental hygienist. She said they were maybe 4 months from losing their house. I asked about Grandpa Ren. Dad explained that Grandpa had invested heavily in some stocks that tanked and lost most of his retirement savings. He was living with them now and contributing what he could from Social Security, but it wasn't much. Uncle Everett chimed in through speakerphone. They'd called him before I arrived, saying he'd co-signed on 2 of Dad's business loans, and if those went into default, his credit would be destroyed, and he might face collections. He said he had his own family to think about and couldn't afford to take that hit. The whole conversation took almost 2 hours. I asked detailed questions about every aspect of their situations. I made them justify their expenses, explain their decisions, walk through how they'd gotten into these positions. And here's the thing, I wasn't doing it to understand their problems. I was doing it to make them relive every failure while I sat there successful and untouchable. I wanted them to feel the humiliation of explaining their inadequacies to the person they'd called a pathetic waste of space. When we finished going through everything, I told them I needed to review all the documents they'd brought, and I'd get back to them in a few days. Dad started to push back, saying they didn't have a few days. The bank wasn't going to wait. I cut him off and said if he wanted my help, he'd accept my timeline. That shut him up immediately. The power dynamic was so clear, you could have written it on the table between us. Mom tried a different approach. She started talking about how she'd been thinking about that Easter brunch constantly, how she woke up some nights remembering what they'd said to me. how she couldn't believe she'd laughed when Dad called me a waste of space. She said she'd been so wrapped up in supporting her husband that she'd forgotten to be a mother to her son. She got tears in her eyes talking about how proud she was of what I'd accomplished, despite them giving me nothing but cruelty. She said I'd always been smart and capable and she should have seen it then. I told her those were nice words, but words were cheap. I said 7 years ago they'd made it very clear what they thought of me, and I wasn't sure anything had actually changed except their bank accounts. Bryn jumped in saying everything had changed, that watching me walk away that day had haunted her, that she'd realized too late how much she'd taken out her own misery on me. She said Andrew's job loss had shown her how fast everything could fall apart, and she finally understood what I'd gone through during my divorce. I let them talk. I let them apologize and explain and justify. And when they were done, I packed up the documents, said I'd be in touch, and left them sitting there. I could see the panic on their faces as I walked out. They'd just spent 2 hours exposing every weakness they had to someone who'd watched them laugh at his humiliation, and now they had to wait and hope I'd be merciful. The messages started again that night. Mom asking if I was angry about something they'd said. Dad saying he hoped I understood how serious the timeline was. Bryn sending long paragraphs about childhood memories and how much she missed having a brother. They were spiraling, and I was letting them. Here's where it gets interesting, though. 2 days later, I got a message from Grandpa Wren directly. He'd never contacted me individually before. All our communication had gone through the family group chat. He said he wanted to talk to me privately, that there were things I should know that the others weren't saying. He asked if I'd meet him for lunch. I was curious enough to agree. We met on Wednesday at a diner near the hardware store where he used to take me when I was a kid, back before everything went wrong. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that wasn't just physical. He ordered breakfast food even though it was 1 in the afternoon and didn't touch most of it. He told me that Dad's business problems started long before those contracts ended. He said Dad had been mismanaging things for years, taking on debt to maintain appearances, refusing to invest in necessary equipment upgrades, treating employees badly so the good ones left. He said the contract losses were symptoms of bigger problems, not the cause. Then he said something that made me pay attention. He told me that part of the reason Dad had been so cruel to me after my divorce was because my marriage falling apart reminded him of his own failures. Dad had apparently wanted to leave trucking and go into real estate development years ago, but couldn't make it work and had resented being stuck in the family business ever since. Seeing me fail at something made him feel better about his own trapped situation. Grandpa said he'd joined in the Easter brunch humiliation because he'd been angry at me for something else entirely. He admitted he'd lent me $5,000 during my divorce, something I'd actually forgotten about in the chaos of everything that happened after, and I'd never paid him back. He said he knew I'd been struggling, but the money had been part of his emergency fund, and losing it had hurt him financially. He'd been too proud to bring it up directly, so he'd just let the resentment build until it came out as cruelty at that brunch. This was new information, and it changed the calculation. I'd thought their cruelty was just random meanness or them projecting their insecurities. But Grandpa was sitting here telling me there were actual grievances underneath it all. Things I hadn't known about or had forgotten in my own pain. He said he wasn't making excuses for what they did, that humiliating me publicly was inexcusable regardless of their reasons, but he thought I should understand the full picture before I decided anything. Then he said something that really got under my skin. He told me he'd been wrong to treat me that way, and he was genuinely sorry, but he also said I needed to be careful about how far I pushed this revenge. He said he could see I was enjoying making them squirm, and he understood why, but he warned me that the kind of satisfaction I was getting from their desperation could become its own trap. He said he'd spent years being angry at people who'd wronged him, and it had eaten up time he could have spent being happy instead. I told him I appreciated the concern, but this wasn't about becoming consumed by anger. This was about evening the scales. He said the scales never actually even out, that revenge just creates new imbalances. I said maybe, but at least this time the imbalance would be in my favor. He didn't have a response to that. He just looked sad and said he hoped I'd think about it. We finished lunch, and I went home more unsettled than I wanted to admit. Because here's the thing. I'd been so focused on making them suffer that I hadn't really thought about what happened after. If I helped them, would that feel like winning or losing? If I didn't help them and they lost everything, would watching that actually satisfy the anger, or would it just leave emptiness where the rage used to be? And this new information about Dad's resentment and Grandpa's loan, did that change anything, or was it just more excuses? I spent the next few days going through their financial documents, and I have to say, it was worse than they'd admitted. Dad's business wasn't just struggling, it was actively dying. There were maintenance issues he hadn't disclosed, insurance problems, even some safety violations he'd been putting off addressing. Bryn and Andrew's debt was higher than they'd said, and their mortgage was already in pre-foreclosure proceedings. The whole family was balancing on a knife edge, and one more bad month would send them over. And I realized something sitting there looking at all their failures laid out in spreadsheets and bank statements. I could definitely help them. I had the contacts to get Dad new contracts. I knew people looking for warehouse space they could sublease affordably. I could probably even help Andrew network into a new job. But if I did all that, they'd owe me everything. They'd spend years knowing I'd saved them, knowing they'd be homeless and bankrupt without me, knowing that every success they had from here on out came because I chose to be merciful. That was more intoxicating than just watching them fail. Because failure would be quick, but ongoing debt and gratitude? That could last forever. Yesterday, I sent a message to the family group chat. I told them I'd reviewed everything and I was willing to help under specific conditions. I said I'd outline those conditions at a meeting this weekend and they needed to be prepared to accept them or walk away. I made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. They'd take my terms or they'd lose everything. The responses came flooding in. Dad saying yes to anything. Mom saying she'd do whatever I needed. Bryn saying she trusted me. Even Uncle Everett sending a message saying he'd support whatever arrangement I decided on. They agreed without knowing what they were agreeing to. That's how desperate they are, and that's exactly where I want them. The meeting is tomorrow. I've been working out the terms all week, and honestly, I might be more excited about this than I've been about anything in years. Because I'm not just going to help them, I'm going to own them, and they're going to thank me for it. Update 2. Okay, so the meeting happened yesterday, and holy hell, you guys, the looks on their faces when I explained what helping them would actually entail. Some of you called it in the comments. You said they'd agree to anything when desperate and then try to renegotiate later. You were right about the first part. We'll see about the second. I had them meet me at my house this time. Not their territory, mine. I wanted them to see exactly what I'd built while they were busy calling me a failure. My place isn't massive or anything, but it's nice. 4 bedrooms, updated kitchen, good neighborhood. The kind of solid middle-class success that shows someone has their life together. Mom kept looking around when they arrived, making these comments about how lovely everything was. How proud she was. All that stuff she should have said 7 years ago. Dad was quieter, just taking it all in. Bryn looked uncomfortable, like being in my space made the whole situation more real. We sat in my dining room and I had actual printed contracts ready. Yeah, I'd gone to a friend who does contract law and had him help me draft legitimate documents. I wasn't playing around with handshake deals or vague promises. This was going to be binding and official. I started with Dad's business. I told him I'd spoken with 2 companies I'd worked with on construction projects that needed reliable regional trucking for materials and equipment. Both were interested in contracts if Dad could prove he had the capacity. I said I'd personally vouch for him, which would carry weight, but in exchange, I wanted a 30% ownership stake in his company. Not just profit sharing, actual ownership with voting rights on major decisions. Dad's face went through about 5 different expressions. He tried to argue that 30% was too much, that the business had been in our family for 2 generations, that he'd worked his whole life building it. I just looked at him and asked if he'd rather keep 100% of a bankrupt company or 70% of one that might survive. I reminded him he'd said he'd do anything. He got quiet. Then I addressed the warehouse situation. I told him I knew a property owner who had space available in the right area at a reasonable rate. But the lease would need to go through me. Essentially, I'd be subletting to him, which meant if he couldn't pay, I'd be on the hook, but it also meant I controlled whether he kept that space. He started to object again, and I cut him off. I said these were my terms and he could take them or leave them, but if he left them, he'd need to be out of my house in the next 5 minutes because we'd have nothing else to discuss. Mom jumped in trying to smooth things over. She said they understood I was taking a risk helping them and they appreciated it. She asked what I needed from her and Bryn. I told her I'd get to that. For Dad's trucks, I said I'd loan him the money for repairs and maintenance, the amount he'd specified at our last meeting. But it would be a loan with interest, not a gift, and if he defaulted, the company ownership would revert entirely to me. He'd essentially be working for me at that point. I had the terms spelled out in the contract, including payment schedules and penalty clauses. Dad looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't figure out how. Then I turned to Bryn and Andrew. I told them I'd help with their mortgage situation by paying off their pre-foreclosure and covering 3 months of payments to get them current. But in exchange, I wanted them to refinance with me holding a second lien on their house. If they couldn't keep up payments, I'd have legal claim to the property. I also said I'd help Andrew network for a new job through my professional contacts. But he'd owe me a percentage of his first year's salary at whatever position he landed. 10% seemed fair for literally saving his family from homelessness. Andrew actually spoke up then. He said 10% of his salary plus owing me money on the house Felt like indentured servitude. I told him he was welcome to find another solution, but as far as I could tell, I was his only option, and my terms were more generous than any bank would offer, given his current credit situation. Bryn grabbed his arm and told him to stop talking. She asked me what I needed from her specifically. I said I wanted a formal written apology from each of them. Detailed, specific, acknowledging exactly what they'd said and done at that Easter brunch and every incident before it. I wanted them to send it to every family member who'd been present that day. I wanted them to admit they'd been wrong, that they'd driven me away, and that they were only in contact with me now because they needed something. Bryn's face went red. She said that would be humiliating. Everyone would know how badly they'd treated me. I asked her if she remembered what humiliation felt like because I certainly did. Mom started crying. Real tears this time, not the manipulative kind. She said she deserved that and worse, that she'd write whatever I needed. She asked if there was anything else she could do to make this right. I told her she could start by admitting that her love and support had always been conditional on me meeting her expectations. And when I failed at that, she'd decided I wasn't worth her time. She could write that in her apology too. Dad was staring at the contracts like they might spontaneously combust. He asked how long these arrangements would last. I told him the business ownership was permanent. If I was taking on risk, I wanted lasting benefit. The loan would be paid over 5 years. Bryn's mortgage lien would remain until they refinanced me out, which wouldn't be possible until their credit recovered and Andrew had stable employment for at least 2 years. So realistically, we were looking at 3 to 5 years minimum, where I'd have significant financial control over their lives. Uncle Everett video called into the meeting. He couldn't make it in person but wanted to participate. I'd already prepared terms for him too. I told him since he was liable on Dad's business loans, my taking ownership stake would actually protect him from complete exposure. But I wanted him to sign documents acknowledging that he'd participated in humiliating me, and that his willingness to benefit from my help now was hypocritical. He'd have to send that acknowledgement to his own kids and wife. He went silent for a minute, then asked if that was really necessary. I said it was necessary to me. Grandpa Wren was sitting at the end of the table and I'd saved him for last. I told him I remembered the $5,000 loan he'd mentioned at our lunch. I said I'd pay him back the full amount plus 7 years of interest calculated at a fair rate. But I also wanted him to write his own apology specifically addressing how he'd let his pride and resentment turn into cruelty, instead of just asking me directly about the money. He nodded and said he could do that. Here's where it got messy. Dad pushed back hard. He said I was leveraging their desperation to essentially take over his life's work. He said 30% ownership was robbery, and I knew it. He said that yes, they'd treated me badly, but this level of control over their finances and futures was excessive. He accused me of not actually wanting to help them, just wanting to dominate them. I let him finish his whole rant. Then I stood up, walked to my kitchen, poured myself water, and came back. I sat down and told him he was absolutely right. I said I wasn't doing this purely out of family obligation or forgiveness. I was doing this because watching them squirm for the past 2 weeks had been the most satisfying experience I'd had in years, and I wanted to extend that satisfaction indefinitely. I said they'd made me feel powerless and worthless, and now I was offering them the chance to avoid complete ruin, but only if they accepted being somewhat powerless themselves. I told him that was the deal, and he had until the end of the meeting to decide. Mom tried a different tactic. She brought up family loyalty, said that surely I didn't want to be the kind of person who kicked family when they were down. I actually laughed at that. I reminded her that she'd literally laughed when Dad called me a pathetic waste of space. I said family loyalty was something they'd taught me didn't exist, so they couldn't really claim it as a principle now. Bryn started crying then, saying this wasn't who I was, that I'd always been kind, and this vindictive person wasn't me. I told her she didn't know who I was because she'd never bothered to find out beyond her own jealousy and insecurity. The room went completely quiet. Everyone just sat there looking at the contracts in front of them. I could see them all doing calculations. How bad would bankruptcy really be versus accepting my terms? Could they find another solution? Was there any way to negotiate me down? Finally, Dad asked if there was any flexibility on the ownership percentage. I said no. He asked if the loan interest rate could be lower. I said the rate I'd specified was already below market for his risk profile. Andrew asked if the salary percentage could be reduced. I said no. Bryn asked if the apology letters had to go to everyone or just immediate family. I told her everyone who'd been at that brunch needed to see it. Then Grandpa Wren said something that shifted the energy. He told Dad to take the deal. He said they'd brought this on themselves and I was offering them a lifeboat, even if it came with conditions. He said he'd rather live with the humiliation of admitting what they'd done than lose everything out of pride. Mom agreed. She said material things and dignity would both eventually recover, but financial ruin would follow them for decades. She said they should sign. Dad looked betrayed. He argued with Grandpa for a while about the business, about family legacy, about what it meant that his own father was telling him to sign away part of his company. Grandpa just repeated that it was either this or nothing, and nothing meant losing the business entirely anyway. Dad turned to Bryn and Andrew. Andrew said he didn't want to lose their house, and if this was the only way to keep it, then they didn't have a choice. Bryn just nodded. But Dad wasn't done. He started negotiating in earnest then, trying to find any angle that would reduce the terms. He proposed that maybe he could pay me back faster and reduce the ownership stake once the business was stable. I said no. The ownership was permanent and non-negotiable. He suggested that maybe the contracts could be private family arrangements without formal legal documentation. I said that was exactly what would not happen because I'd learned from their treatment of me that family promises meant nothing without enforcement mechanisms. He even tried appealing to my better nature, saying he could see I was angry, but surely I didn't want to do permanent damage to our relationships. I told him our relationship had been permanently damaged 7 years ago when he stood up at Easter and called me pathetic in front of everyone. I said I was just making sure the damage was mutual now. And honestly, seeing him trying every manipulation tactic he could think of while I just calmly said no to each one felt incredible. This was exactly the power reversal I'd spent years imagining. Eventually, he just deflated. He asked how we'd proceed if they signed. I laid out the timeline. We'd execute the contracts today. I'd make the initial financial arrangements within 48 hours, paying off Bryn's pre-foreclosure, transferring the warehouse space lease, arranging the truck repair financing. The apology letters would need to be written and distributed within 1 week. Dad would need to provide me with full access to the business accounts and operations within 2 weeks so I could exercise my ownership rights. Andrew would need to start job searching immediately with my guidance on where to apply. Mom asked what happened after that. I said we'd see. If they honored the agreements and made their payments, life would go on with the new power dynamic in place. If they defaulted or tried to back out, I'd exercise my full rights under the contracts, including taking complete ownership of the business and foreclosing on Bryn's house. I'd built in enough legal protection that they couldn't screw me the way they'd been screwed by their own decisions. Dad asked for time to think about it. I told him he had until they left my house today. After that, the offer expired and they'd be on their own. I said I had other things to do with my money and my time if they weren't interested. They asked for a private family discussion. I left them in my dining room and went to my home office. I could hear raised voices through the door. Dad arguing, Mom crying, Bryn trying to mediate. It went on for almost an hour. Finally, Mom came and got me. When I walked back in, Dad had clearly lost the fight. He said they'd accept my terms. All of them. He said he wanted it on record that he thought I was being vindictive and excessive, but he couldn't see another option. I told him his feelings were noted and irrelevant. We spent the next 2 hours going through each contract, making sure they understood every clause, and getting signatures. Uncle Everett signed his acknowledgement over video with witnesses present. Grandpa Wren signed his documents without argument. By the time everyone left, I had legally binding agreements that gave me significant control over their financial futures and required them to publicly admit what they'd done to me. Mom hugged me before she left. She said she hoped someday I'd be able to forgive them beyond just these business arrangements. I didn't hug her back. I told her forgiveness wasn't part of the contract. So now it's done. I own 30% of Dad's business. I hold liens and loans on multiple family members. I'm going to receive formal written apologies distributed to everyone who watched them humiliate me. And they're all going to spend the next several years making payments to me and answering to me and being reminded every single month that I'm the only reason they're not homeless. Some of you are probably thinking, this is too far, that I should have just helped them or walked away but not created this elaborate control structure. But here's what you need to understand. They didn't just hurt my feelings 7 years ago. They fundamentally broke my trust in family, in unconditional love, in the idea that people who are supposed to care about you won't destroy you for entertainment. They taught me that relationships are transactional and conditional. So now our relationship is explicitly transactional and the conditions favor me. The apology letters are supposed to be sent by next Friday. I'm genuinely curious to see if they'll actually do it or if they'll try to renegotiate that part. If they don't send them, the contracts allow me to accelerate all the payment terms and call in the debts immediately. They'd be right back where they started, but with legal judgments against them now, too. This isn't over. This is actually just beginning, and I'm going to enjoy every minute of it. Final update. It's been 6 weeks since they signed those contracts, and I need to tell you how this has played out because it's been even better than I imagined. For those just joining, quick recap. My family publicly humiliated me 7 years ago. I spent that time building success specifically, so I'd have leverage when they eventually needed me. They came crawling back desperate and broke, and I made them sign contracts that gave me partial ownership of my dad's business plus financial control over multiple family members in exchange for saving them from bankruptcy. They agreed to everything, including writing formal apologies to everyone who witnessed my humiliation. The apology letters went out last Friday, all of them. I know because I required them to send me copies before distributing them to the family. Mom's was 3 pages long, talking about how she'd failed as a mother by prioritizing her marriage over her son, how she'd laughed at cruel jokes instead of defending me, how she'd let her own insecurities about our family image make her view my divorce as a reflection on her rather than supporting me through it. Dad's was shorter but hit the key points, admitting he'd projected his own failures onto me, acknowledging he'd used me as a verbal punching bag to feel better about being trapped in a business he resented, apologizing for the specific things he'd said at Easter. Brins went into detail about her jealousy, how she'd resented that I'd had the courage to leave my marriage while she felt stuck in hers, how she'd taken out her frustrations by joining in the family mockery. The fallout from those letters has been spectacular. I started getting messages from extended family members within hours. Some were supportive, saying they'd always thought that Easter brunch went too far but hadn't known how to intervene. Others were clearly uncomfortable that private family drama was being aired this way. A few tried to play mediator, asking if this was really necessary or if we could all just move forward. I ignored most of them except to say that the apologies were part of a private family agreement, and I'd appreciate them respecting that. But here's where it gets interesting. My cousin Wendy, Uncle Everett's daughter, sent me a long message saying she'd always looked up to me and been confused why the family treated me so badly. She said reading her dad's acknowledgement letter where he admitted to participating in my humiliation out of insecurity made her see him differently. She asked if we could get lunch sometime and actually talk because she felt like she'd never really known me beyond the family narrative that I was the failure. We met last week at a barbecue place near her work and spent 2 hours just talking. Turns out she's been dealing with her own family pressure issues, and seeing me stand up to everyone gave her permission to start setting boundaries with her own parents. That was unexpected, but honestly kind of nice. The business side has been even more satisfying. I exercised my ownership rights immediately and started attending Dad's operations meetings. The first one was incredibly awkward. Dad had to introduce me to his 3 remaining employees as a new partial owner who'd be involved in major decisions going forward. You could see him dying inside, having to explain that his son, the one he'd called a waste of space, was now technically his boss in many ways. One of the employees, a guy who'd worked there for 15 years, actually knew me from when I used to help out as a teenager. He seemed genuinely happy to see me and asked what I'd been doing since then. I gave him the short version about construction project management, and he said that made sense. I'd always been good with logistics. Dad looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. I've been pushing for operational changes that Dad's been avoiding. Better maintenance schedules, updated GPS tracking systems for the trucks, actual customer service protocols. He's pushed back on every single one, saying they can't afford it or it's not how he's always done things. I've had to remind him multiple times that he signed over decision-making authority, and if he wants to keep his 70%, he needs to let me do what I'm there to do. Last week, I approved a purchase for diagnostic equipment over his objections. He sent me a long text about how I was spending money unnecessarily and putting the company at risk. I sent back a screenshot of the contract clause about my authority over operational spending and told him to review the documents he signed. The trucking contracts I arranged have started coming through. The first company needed materials transported for a commercial development project, and Dad's guys handled it well. The client was satisfied and wants to continue using us. That contract alone will stabilize the business finances for the next 6 months. Dad sent me a message thanking me for making it happen, but you could tell it killed him to admit he needed my connections. I just replied that this was what he'd agreed to, and I expected him to maintain the same quality of service on all the jobs I brought in because my reputation was now tied to his company performance. Bryn and Andrew's situation has been messier. I paid off their pre-foreclosure like I promised and covered 3 months of mortgage payments. But Andrew's job search has been slower than expected, and they're starting to panic about what happens when those 3 months run out. Andrew applied to several positions I'd suggested through my network, but hasn't gotten offers yet. Last week, Bryn called me almost in tears, saying they couldn't keep up with their other bills, even with the mortgage temporarily handled, and could I help them with some additional expenses. I reminded her that our agreement covered the mortgage, nothing else, and she needed to figure out their budget. She got defensive, saying I had the money and could easily help more, that I was being cruel by withholding assistance when I could afford it. I told her that cruelty was public humiliation at a family holiday. This was just enforcing contract terms. That conversation led to a huge fight between us. She accused me of enjoying their suffering too much, of taking revenge too far, of being so focused on payback that I'd lost sight of basic human decency. She said Mom was right that I'd become someone she didn't recognize. I asked her when exactly she'd known me well enough to recognize anything about me. She couldn't answer that. I pointed out that for the past 7 years, she'd had zero interest in who I was or what I was doing until she needed something from me. She said that wasn't fair, that she'd thought about reaching out multiple times but didn't know how after what happened. I told her that thinking about doing something and actually doing it were completely different things, and I'd spent 7 years learning that the hard way. We went back and forth for almost an hour. She kept trying to make it about me being vindictive while I kept bringing it back to the fact that they'd created this situation themselves. She brought up childhood memories, trying to appeal to some sense of nostalgia or brotherly affection. I shut that down fast. I told her our childhood didn't excuse what she'd done as an adult, and I wasn't interested in pretending we had some deep bond that would override 7 years of silence and cruelty. She finally said she regretted ever sending Mom that first message asking for help. I told her she regretted the consequences, not the actions that led there. The phone call ended with both of us angry. She hasn't contacted me since. Mom sent a message a few days later saying Bryn was really struggling emotionally, and could I please be more gentle with her? I asked Mom if she'd been gentle with me at Easter. She said that was different because they'd been wrong then, but I was being deliberately harsh now. I said the only difference was who had the power, and apparently she only cared about kindness when it benefited her. Dad tried a different approach. He invited me to dinner at their house, just the four of us, him, Mom, Bryn, and me. He framed it as a chance to work on rebuilding our family relationships separate from the business arrangements. I agreed mostly because I was curious what he was planning. The dinner was this past Tuesday, and it was as uncomfortable as you'd expect. Mom had cooked my favorite meal from childhood, which felt like an obvious manipulation tactic. Bryn barely made eye contact with me. Dad kept trying to steer conversation toward neutral topics like sports or weather. Finally, halfway through the meal, Dad got to his real point. He said he'd been thinking about the business arrangement and wanted to propose a modification. He offered to buy back 5% of my ownership stake at a premium price. He'd worked out financing through a different lender and thought this would be good for both of us. I'd make a profit and he'd regain some control. I asked him why he thought I'd be interested in that. He said because clearly the current arrangement was causing family tension and maybe we could find a middle ground that worked better. I told him no. He pressed, asking what it would take to renegotiate. I said there was nothing to renegotiate because I wasn't interested in changing terms that were working perfectly well for me. He got frustrated and said the terms weren't working well for anyone, that I was using the contracts to maintain control and punish them rather than actually helping. I pointed out that the company was now getting contracts and staying afloat specifically because of my involvement. He said that was true, but came at the cost of his autonomy and dignity. That's when I really let him have it. I told him that 7 years ago, he'd decided my dignity was worthless entertainment value. He'd stood up in front of our entire extended family and called me pathetic because it made him feel better about his own failures. He'd taught me that family relationships were about power and who could hurt who worst. Now he was upset that I'd learned the lesson too well and had more power than him. He tried to argue that he'd apologized and was trying to make amends. I said his apology was damage control after facing consequences, not genuine remorse. And his attempt to renegotiate the contracts proved he still didn't understand that this wasn't a situation where he got to set terms anymore. Mom intervened, trying to calm things down. She said they understood I was hurt and had every right to be angry, but at some point we needed to move past the past and focus on rebuilding. I asked her what rebuilding looked like to her. She said family dinners like this, regular communication, being involved in each other's lives again. I told her we were involved in each other's lives. I was involved in their finances, their business, their ability to keep their house. That was involvement. If she wanted warm, fuzzy family bonding on top of that, she needed to accept that it might take more than 6 weeks and some home-cooked meals to undo 7 years of demonstrating that their love was conditional on me meeting their expectations. Bryn finally spoke up. She said I was never going to forgive them no matter what they did, that I'd decided to hate them forever and was just using the contracts to maintain an excuse to punish them. She said I could either choose to be family or choose to be their creditor, but I couldn't be both. I told her she was wrong. I could absolutely be both, and that's exactly what I was doing. The contracts ensured they couldn't hurt me again because I had leverage. Maybe someday I'd feel safe enough to attempt actual family relationship rebuilding, but that day wasn't today and wouldn't be anytime soon. Dad said that was basically holding them hostage, that I was saying they had to maintain financial obligations to me indefinitely, while I decided if and when to grant them emotional forgiveness. I said yes. That was exactly what I was saying, and it was identical to what they'd done to me except their conditions had been impossible to meet. I couldn't change that my marriage failed, couldn't change that I'd struggled financially, couldn't change that I didn't live up to whatever image they'd wanted me to project. At least my conditions were clear and achievable. Make your payments, honor the contracts, prove over time that your apologies were real. The dinner ended badly. I left while they were still sitting at the table. Mom sent me a message later saying she wished I could see that they were trying. I didn't respond. Here's what's become clear to me over these 6 weeks. They want absolution without accountability. They want to say sorry and have everything go back to normal without actually experiencing consequences for what they did. They're learning that's not how this works. Every time Dad has to consult me on a business decision, every time Bryn makes a mortgage payment that includes my lien, every time Mom sees me and remembers the apology letter she had to send, that's them living with the consequences. Not abstract karma or divine justice, but concrete daily reminders that actions have lasting impacts. Some people in the comments have said, I'm going to regret this years from now, that revenge doesn't actually heal anything, and I'll end up bitter and alone. Maybe they're right. But right now, watching my family finally understand that I'm not someone who can be dismissed or mocked without repercussions feels better than any forgiveness arc ever could. I spent 7 years preparing for this, and I'm not about to cut it short because it makes them uncomfortable. The business is stabilizing. Andrew finally got a job offer through one of my contacts and starts next month, which means Bryn's household should be able to manage payments going forward. Grandpa Wren paid me back the $5,000 plus interest and has been relatively quiet. Uncle Everett is complying with his agreements without pushing back. Everything is proceeding exactly as I'd planned. And yeah, maybe this makes me vindictive. Maybe I should be the bigger person. But I tried being the bigger person 7 years ago when I quietly accepted their cruelty and just left. That version of me got nothing except years of anger and betrayal. This version of me has 30% of a business, financial leverage over multiple family members, and the satisfaction of knowing they'll think twice before underestimating me again. They're outside my property now. Well, not literally this moment, but metaphorically, they're always outside my boundaries begging to be let back in on their terms. And I'm inside holding all the keys deciding if and when to open that door. 7 years ago, I set down flowers and smiled peacefully while they laughed. Now they're the ones smiling desperately while I decide their futures. That Easter brunch humiliation was the best thing that ever happened to me because it showed me exactly who they were and gave me the motivation to become someone they couldn't hurt anymore. They taught me that family is transactional and power matters more than love. I just became better at the transaction than they ever were. So to everyone who said I should just walk away or take the high road, I did walk away. 7 years ago. This isn't me holding on to the past. This is me making sure the present and future look exactly how I want them to look. And they look pretty good from where I'm sitting.